The cameras were rolling, the chamber was packed, and what happened next will go down as the most brutal political destruction ever broadcast live to millions. Ursula von der Leyen walked into that parliament chamber expecting another routine session. What she got instead was a public execution so vicious, so coordinated, so absolutely devastating that within hours, entire nations erupted in protest. The streets of Brussels exploded. Berlin descended into chaos. Paris burned with rage. And the message from the people was deafening and crystal clear. She must go now. But here is what they are not telling you. This is not just about one woman's career ending in flames. This is the beginning of the end for the entire European Union as we know it. The dominoes are falling faster than anyone predicted. The anger is real. The economic collapse is accelerating, and the clock is ticking down to zero. What you are about to witness is the real-time disintegration of a superpower that took decades to build. This is not speculation. This is documented reality, and by the time this is over, the world will never be the same again. It began at exactly 10:15 a.m. Central European Time. The European Parliament chamber in Strasbourg was filled beyond capacity. Every seat was occupied, every camera positioned, every journalist ready. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Ursula von der Leyen entered through the main doors, flanked by her security detail and senior advisors. She carried a folder of prepared remarks. She wore her signature composed expression. She believed this would be another manageable session, another opportunity to defend her policies with carefully crafted talking points. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush that would destroy her career in less than 2 hours. The session opened with procedural formalities. The chamber president called the meeting to order. The agenda was announced, and then it happened. The first strike came from a German member of the European Parliament, a representative from her own political family, someone who was supposed to be an ally. He rose to speak, and the tone of his voice immediately signaled that something was different. This was not going to be a polite disagreement. This was going to be war. He began by stating that he could no longer, in good conscience, remain silent about the catastrophic failures of the current Commission leadership. He said the European Union had become a laughingstock on the global stage. He said decades of carefully built diplomatic credibility had been incinerated in a matter of weeks. He said the citizens of Europe were suffering while leadership remained detached, arrogant, and completely out of touch with reality. And then he said the words that detonated the entire chamber. He said, "Ursula von der Leyen must resign immediately for the good of Europe." The reaction was instantaneous. Half the chamber erupted in thunderous applause. The other half sat in stunned silence. Von der Leyen's face went pale. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of shock and panic crossing her features. But this was just the beginning. Within seconds, a French representative requested the floor. Permission was granted. She stood and delivered an even more brutal assessment. She cited the recent diplomatic disaster with the United States, the complete refusal of the American administration to even acknowledge European leadership, the utter humiliation of watching decades-old alliances crumble because of incompetent handling of critical negotiations. She accused Van Donder of single-handedly destroying the transatlantic relationship that had guaranteed European security since World War II. The applause grew louder, then an Italian MEP rose. He did not wait for formal recognition. He simply began speaking, his voice cutting through the chaos. He talked about the economic devastation sweeping across his country. Factories closing, unemployment skyrocketing, small businesses collapsing under the weight of policies created in Brussels by people who had never run a business, never struggled to make payroll, never watched their life's work disappear because of bureaucratic incompetence. He said Italian families were suffering, Italian workers were desperate, and the person responsible was standing right there in that chamber, hiding behind speeches and excuses while real people paid the price. The chamber was now in full revolt. One by one, representatives from Poland, Hungary, the Netherlands, Austria, and Spain rose to deliver their verdicts. The language was brutal. The accusations were devastating. They talked about corruption. They talked about financial mismanagement. They talked about authoritarian overreach. They talked about betrayal of European values. Each speaker seemed to feed off the energy of the previous one, escalating the attacks to levels rarely seen in parliamentary proceedings. Von der Leyen attempted to interject. She raised her hand. She requested the floor. The chamber president initially ignored her. When she finally stood and approached the microphone, the jeering began. Actual jeering. Grown politicians, elected representatives, openly mocking a sitting commission president. She tried to speak. Her voice cracked. The microphone picked up every tremor of weakness, every hint of desperation. She attempted to defend her record. She cited trade agreements that nobody cared about, She mentioned climate initiatives that seemed completely disconnected from the fury erupting around her. She talked about digital transformation while representatives actually laughed out loud. It was the most humiliating moment in modern European political history. A leader being openly ridiculed by the very institution that is supposed to provide democratic legitimacy to her authority. The footage of that moment, her voice breaking, her hand shaking, the laughter echoing through the chamber, went viral within minutes. Social media platforms exploded. The hashtag demanding her resignation hit #1 trending across 12 European nations simultaneously. But the parliamentary destruction was only the beginning of her nightmare. While she was still standing at that podium trying to maintain some shred of dignity, protests were already erupting outside. By noon, the streets of Brussels had transformed into a war zone of public fury. Thousands of citizens flooded the area surrounding the Parlement building, the massive headquarters of the European Commission where van der Leyen maintains her office. These were not fringe activists or professional protesters. These were ordinary Europeans who had reached their breaking point. Teachers who could barely afford to heat their classrooms, factory workers watching their industries collapse under the weight of regulations created by people who had never set foot in a manufacturing plant, small business owners drowning in paperwork and taxes while bureaucrats in Brussels collected massive salaries, students facing a future with no jobs, no opportunities, and no hope. They carried signs with messages that could not be misunderstood. Thunder Lion must go. Europe deserves leadership, not disaster. Stop destroying our future. The anger was not manufactured by political operatives or coordinated by opposition parties. This was raw, visceral rage from people who felt betrayed, abandoned, and sold out by the very institutions that were supposed to protect their interests. Police formed barricades around the Commission building, riot shields locked together, water cannons positioned strategically. But the crowd continued to grow. By early afternoon, estimates put the number at over 50,000 in Brussels alone, and the movement was spreading like wildfire across the continent. In Berlin, protesters gathered outside the Chancellery demanding that Olaf Scholz publicly call for von der Leyen's immediate removal. The German Chancellor was already facing catastrophic approval ratings, and his association with her leadership was dragging him further into political oblivion. His advisors were in full panic mode, calculating whether defending her would trigger the final collapse of his governing coalition. In Paris, demonstrators blocked major intersections, bringing traffic to a complete standstill across the city center. The French capital, already simmering with economic discontent and social unrest, exploded with fury at the perceived incompetence of European leadership. Emmanuel Macron himself, barely clinging to political survival, faced enormous pressure from his own party members to distance himself from van der Leyen before she dragged him down with her. In Rome, the situation turned violent. Riot police deployed tear gas to disperse crowds attempting to storm government buildings. Protesters threw stones and bottles, windows were smashed, fires were lit in the streets. The Italian government, already skeptical of Brussels' bureaucracy, watched the chaos and saw an opportunity to break free from policies they had always opposed. The mainstream media scrambled desperately to control the narrative, but the dam had already broken beyond repair. Independent journalists on the ground captured footage that establishment outlets refused to broadcast. Interviews with protesters revealed a common theme that terrified the political elite. These people did not just want van der Leyen gone. They wanted the entire system dismantled. They wanted accountability for years of failed policies, wasted resources, and broken promises. One woman, a nurse from Lyon, spoke directly to a camera with tears streaming down her face. She described how her hospital could barely afford basic medical supplies while billions of euros were being sent overseas to fund projects that had nothing to do with the health and safety of European citizens. She talked about elderly patients suffering because the healthcare system was collapsing from within, starved of resources while bureaucrats in Brussels lived in luxury. She said, van der Leyen must answer for these crimes against ordinary people. Her video was shared millions of times within hours. It became the face of the movement. The human cost of technocratic failure laid bare for the world to see. This was no longer a political debate confined to elite circles and parliamentary procedures. This was a populist uprising, and it was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control it. Inside the Parlement building, sources reported total chaos behind closed doors. Emergency meetings were convened in conference rooms throughout the building. Thunder Lion's inner circle was fracturing in real time. Key advisors who had stood by her through previous controversies were now reportedly distancing themselves, preparing exit strategies before the entire ship sank beneath the waves. Leaks from Commission communications suggested that several member states were preparing formal motions of no confidence, a procedural nuclear weapon rarely deployed in EU politics. Poland and Hungary, longtime critics of her leadership style and policy priorities, were leading the charge with aggressive rhetoric and concrete legislative actions. But even traditional allies were wavering. French and German representatives were notably absent from public statements of support. The silence was deafening and damning. The economic implications of this political meltdown were catastrophic and accelerating by the hour. Markets across Europe entered full panic mode as investors watched the chaos unfold on their screens. The euro plummeted to a 5-year low against the dollar, wiping out billions in value within a single trading session. Major financial institutions issued emergency warnings about European stability. Investment funds began massive sell-offs of European assets at a pace not seen since the darkest days of the 2008 financial crisis. This was not a temporary fluctuation or market correction. This was a fundamental loss of confidence in the European project itself. Major corporations that had built their operations around a stable, unified European market were now issuing stark warnings about their future on the continent. Volkswagen announced emergency cost-cutting measures that included potential layoffs affecting tens of thousands of workers across multiple countries. BMW suspended all future investment plans in Europe indefinitely, signaling that it was preparing to shift resources to more stable markets. Siemens, one of Europe's industrial giants, released a statement questioning the viability of continuing major operations on the continent if the current political and economic trajectory continued unchanged. These were not idle threats or negotiating tactics. These were billion-dollar corporations making cold calculations about survival in an increasingly unstable environment. The German industrial sector, already reeling from skyrocketing energy costs and the recent catastrophic breakdown in trade relations with the United States, was teetering on the edge of total collapse. Factory orders were down, export numbers were cratering, the economic engine that had powered European prosperity for generations was sputtering and dying. But the economic crisis was only one dimension of the disaster unfolding in real time. The security situation was equally terrifying for anyone paying attention to strategic realities. With NATO effectively weakened by American disengagement and European military capabilities exposed as woefully inadequate, the continent found itself more vulnerable than at any point since the end of the Cold War. Military analysts were openly questioning whether European nations had the capability, the resources, or the political will to mount any credible defense without American support and leadership. Russia was watching closely, analyzing every development with strategic interest. China was watching closely, calculating how European weakness could be exploited for economic and political advantage. Every adversary and competitor on the global stage could sense opportunity. Van der Leyen's catastrophic failure to maintain the transatlantic alliance, her inability to navigate the shifting geopolitical landscape, had left Europe exposed and defenseless at the worst possible moment in modern history. Intelligence reports circulating among defense ministries suggested increased military activity along eastern borders. There were credible whispers of provocations being planned to test European resolve and unity. If Brussels could not even manage its own internal political crisis, if member states were openly revolting against central authority, how could anyone expect a coordinated defense strategy against external threats? The answer terrified every serious strategist on the continent. It could not be done. The European Union as a functioning political and military entity was disintegrating before the world's eyes. And then came the most explosive revelation of the entire parliamentary session. A Dutch MEP rose with documents in hand, obtained through Freedom of Information requests after months of legal battles. He presented evidence showing that van der Leyen's office had allegedly authorized payments to external consulting firms totaling over 200 million euros without proper oversight, transparency, or accountability. The contracts were deliberately vague, the deliverables were impossibly unclear, and the firms involved had direct connections to political operatives who had actively campaigned in multiple member states on behalf of specific policy agendas that benefited from Commission decisions. This was not administrative incompetence or bureaucratic confusion. This was potential corruption on a scale that dwarfed every previous EU scandal. The MEP demanded an immediate independent investigation. He demanded full disclosure of all financial records. He demanded accountability and consequences. The chamber erupted once again, but this time even van der Leyen's most loyal defenders sat in stunned, damning silence. There was no defense prepared. There was no explanation offered. just a crushing weight of allegations that could bring down not just one politician, but potentially expose systemic corruption throughout the entire commission structure. Van der Leyen attempted to leave the chamber through a side exit, surrounded by security personnel forming a protective barrier around her. Journalists swarmed. Questions were shouted from every direction. Cameras flashed continuously. She said nothing. Her face was ashen, her hands visibly shaking. This was a woman who had lost complete control. This was a leader who knew the end was coming and could do nothing to stop it. By evening, 8 member states had officially called for an emergency summit to discuss a formal vote of no confidence. The European Union stood on the brink of total collapse. The protests were intensifying, the economic crisis was accelerating, and the woman at the center of it all was running out of time and options. History was being written in real time, and the next 72 hours would determine whether the European project survived or died. This was the endgame. Overnight, the crisis deepened. What had begun as a parliamentary rebellion transformed into a continental reckoning. Emergency broadcasts interrupted regular programming across Europe. Political talk shows abandoned their scheduled guests and filled their panels with constitutional experts, former commissioners, military analysts, and market strategists. The question was no longer whether Ursula von der Leyen could survive politically. The question was whether the European Union itself could withstand the shock wave unleashed inside that chamber. Behind closed doors, frantic negotiations stretched into the early hours of the morning. Heads of government held secure video conferences. Some argued for immediate damage control, a unified statement of support to calm markets and restore a semblance of stability. Others insisted that backing her now would only tie their own political futures to a sinking ship. The divisions were not subtle. They were stark, emotional, and deeply personal. In Berlin, coalition partners reportedly clashed over whether Germany should publicly call for her resignation. And in Paris, advisors debated whether distancing the Elysee Palace from Brussels would preserve domestic stability or accelerate fragmentation. And in smaller member states, leaders faced a different calculation. If the center was collapsing, should they move quickly to reclaim national authority before events spiraled further out of control? Meanwhile, the financial markets opened to another wave of panic. Bond yields in several southern European countries surged as investors priced in political risk not seen in years. Banking stocks fell sharply amid fears of regulatory paralysis. Currency traders speculated openly about the long-term durability of the euro if institutional confidence continued to erode. The language in analyst notes shifted from cautious concern to outright alarm. Words like systemic structural fracture and existential threat became common. On the streets, the protests did not subside. They multiplied. Demonstrations that had begun as calls for resignation evolved into broader demands for reform. In Brussels, organizers erected makeshift stages where speakers denounced what they described as years of democratic deficit and technocratic detachment. In Warsaw and Budapest, rallies blended long-standing sovereignty grievances with fresh outrage. In Madrid and Athens, economic frustrations resurfaced with renewed intensity.